The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential airfield in Ouagadougou as President Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his military beret one final time. The assembled soldiers stood at attention, their olive uniforms crisp against the red dust of Burkina Faso's capital. Today's mission was routine, a visit to the northern military outposts to inspect border security and boost morale among the troops fighting insurgents. Traoré had risen to power through the ranks, a young captain who had seized control during the turbulent months when the previous government had failed to stem the tide of jihadist violence plaguing the Sahel region. At 34, he was one of Africa's youngest heads of state, a man who had promised to restore dignity to his people and break the chains of foreign dependence that had bound Burkina Faso for decades. The helicopter, a Soviet-era Mi-17, painted in military green, sat on the tarmac with its rotors slowly beginning to turn. Chief of Staff Colonel Damiba approached with the final security briefing, his weathered face serious as always. "Mr. President, the northern route is clear. We've had reconnaissance flights all morning. No unusual activity detected," Damiba reported, saluting sharply. Traoré nodded, his keen eyes scanning the perimeter one last time. Something felt different today, though he couldn't place what it was. Perhaps it was the new security detail member, Sergeant Jules Cobanon, who had been transferred from the Ivorian training exchange program just a month ago. The man stood at his post near the helicopter, ramrod straight, but there was something about his eyes that didn't sit well with the president. "Colonel, remind me again about the new sergeant," Traoré said quietly. "Cobanon, excellent record from Abidjan, part of the West African Unity Program. His commanding officer spoke highly of his technical skills," Damiba replied, consulting his tablet. Traoré's instincts had kept him alive through 3 coup attempts and countless assassination plots. Today those instincts whispered warnings he couldn't ignore. But the schedule was tight, and the northern commanders were expecting him. As he walked toward the aircraft, the assembled soldiers began to cheer. "Vive le Président! Vive Burkina Faso!" Their voices echoed across the airfield, a sound that always stirred something deep in Traoré's chest. These were his people, young men and women who had chosen to serve their country despite meager pay and constant danger. He climbed the steps into the helicopter, settling into his seat as his personal security chief, Captain Kabore, performed one final equipment check. The interior smelled of aviation fuel and hot metal. Through the small windows he could see the faces of his soldiers, their expressions a mixture of pride and concern. The pilots, Major Ouedraogo and Lieutenant Sawadogo, had flown him safely on dozens of missions. They exchanged their usual pre-flight pleasantries, discussing weather conditions and flight time. Everything appeared normal. "Engines spooling up, Mr. President," Major Ouedraogo called back from the cockpit. The helicopter began to lift slowly from the tarmac. Dust swirled in violent circles beneath the rotor wash, and Traoré raised his hand in a final wave to the assembled troops below. It was at that precise moment, with the aircraft barely 10 feet off the ground, that his world exploded into chaos. The detonation came from the port engine with the force of a lightning strike. A brilliant flash of orange flame erupted from the turbine housing, followed immediately by the screaming whine of disintegrating metal. The helicopter lurched violently to the left as pieces of the engine cowling transformed into deadly projectiles, slicing through the air with murderous intent. "Mayday! Engine failure!" Major Ouedraogo's voice cracked over the intercom as he fought to control the aircraft. The cabin filled with acrid smoke and the smell of aviation fuel. Through the chaos, Traoré's training kicked in. He had been a paratrooper before becoming president, and his body remembered what his mind might have forgotten. As the helicopter tilted dangerously and began to spin, he made a split-second decision that would save his life. The ground was rushing up, too fast. Without hesitation, Traoré threw himself from the open door of the crippled aircraft. He hit the tarmac hard, his body rolling instinctively to absorb the impact. Pain shot through his left shoulder, and he felt blood trickling down his forehead, but he was alive. Behind him, the helicopter continued its death spiral. The remaining engine, overwhelmed by the sudden asymmetric load, began to fail catastrophically. The aircraft rose another 50 feet before the secondary explosion turned it into a fireball that painted the morning sky in shades of orange and black. The explosion was deafening. Soldiers scattered in every direction as burning debris rained down across the airfield. Pieces of twisted metal, some still glowing red-hot, embedded themselves in the tarmac around the president's prone form. For a moment that stretched like eternity, silence fell over the scene. Then the screaming began, not from the dying aircraft, but from the men and women who thought they had just witnessed their president's assassination. Through the smoke and chaos, a figure emerged. President Ibrahim Traoré staggered to his feet, his uniform torn and bloody, his face blackened by smoke, but his eyes burning with an intensity that made even his closest aides take a step back. This was not a man grateful to be alive. This was a man who had just realized he was at war. "Secure the perimeter!" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. Captain Traoré, who had been thrown clear in the initial explosion, rushed to his president's side. "Sir, we need to get you to medical." "Medical can wait," Traoré cut him off, wiping blood from his eyes. "This was no accident, Captain. Someone just tried to kill me, and they're still here." Within minutes of the explosion, the Ouagadougou Air Base transformed from a routine military facility into the epicenter of a national security crisis. Emergency vehicles screamed across the tarmac as soldiers established a defensive perimeter around the burning wreckage. No one entered or left the base without explicit authorization from the president himself. Dr. Fatima Ouattara, the base medical officer, insisted on examining Traoré despite his protests. In a hastily established medical station, she cleaned the gash on his forehead and checked for signs of concussion. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. President," she said, applying antiseptic that made him wince. "A few more seconds in that aircraft." "Luck had nothing to do with it, Doctor," Traoré replied grimly. "Someone wanted me dead, but they underestimated me." As Dr. Ouattara worked, Captain Traoré burst into the medical station with a tablet in his hands, his face pale. "Mr. President, we have a problem. I've been conducting roll call of all security personnel present during the incident. And Sergeant Kobanon is missing. He was at his post near the helicopter 20 minutes before takeoff, but no one has seen him since the explosion." Traoré's jaw tightened. His instincts about the new sergeant had been correct. Pull his file, everything, background check, references, biometrics. Within an hour, a team of intelligence specialists had assembled in the base's communications center. The room hummed with activity as technicians worked to piece together the puzzle of Jules Kobanon. What they discovered sent chills through everyone present. Lieutenant Zongo, the base intelligence officer, delivered the findings with barely controlled alarm in his voice. "Mr. President, we've run Sergeant Kobanon's biometrics through every database we have access to, military records, civil registration, even Interpol files." "What did you find?" "Nothing, sir. According to our systems, Jules Kobanon doesn't exist. Not his fingerprints, not his facial recognition profile, not his DNA from the hair sample we retrieved from his quarters. Whoever he is, he's been operating under a completely fabricated identity." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Traoré stood motionless for a long moment, processing the implications.
"Show me the security footage from this morning," he ordered. The large screen at the front of the room flickered to life, displaying multiple camera angles around the helicopter pad. The technician fast-forwarded through the early morning hours, then slowed as figures began moving around the aircraft. "There," Cabore pointed at the screen, 0630 hours. The figure of Jules Kobanon moved with practiced efficiency around the helicopter. To a casual observer, he appeared to be conducting a routine security inspection. But Traoré noticed something else: the way the man moved, the precision of his actions, the small black case he carried. "Zoom in on that case," Traoré commanded. The image enlarged, showing Kobanon placing the case near the engine housing with careful deliberation. He worked for exactly 90 seconds, his hands moving with the expertise of a professional. Then he sealed the engine cowling, smiled, actually smiled at the camera, and walked away. "He knew we were watching," whispered Captain Cabore. "He didn't care." "No," Traoré corrected, his voice cold as winter wind. "He wanted us to see. This message wasn't just for me, it was for anyone who might think of challenging whoever sent him." The investigation team worked through the afternoon, piecing together more disturbing evidence. Hidden beneath the co-pilot's seat, they discovered a note written in elegant French script. "This is only the first spark. We are inside your walls. The new Africa has no room for false lions. The shadow knows where the lion sleeps." At the bottom of the note was a symbol that made Traoré's blood run cold: a stylized lion's head bisected by a dagger. He had seen that symbol twice before, once carved into a wooden table during a secret meeting about regional security, and once tattooed on the wrist of a man who had attempted to assassinate Thomas Sankara decades earlier. "The Lions of Silence," he whispered, using the English translation of their name. "Sir?" Cabore leaned closer. "Les Silencieux, an organization that officially doesn't exist. They're a network of assassins, spies, and political manipulators who have been operating in West Africa since the 1960s. Most governments deny they exist, but intelligence agencies know better." The implications were staggering. If Les Silencieux had targeted Traoré, it meant the conspiracy against him stretched far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. This wasn't just about regime change, it was about reshaping the entire political landscape of the region. As evening approached, forensic experts finished their examination of the bomb fragments. Chief Inspector Bamogo presented their findings with grim satisfaction. "Mr. President, we've identified the explosive device. It was a sophisticated shaped charge designed to disable the engine and create maximum shrapnel damage. The timer mechanism is Russian-made, but the plastic explosive itself," he held up a fragment in an evidence bag, "this came from France. The serial numbers trace back to a military supplier in Marseille."
The pattern was becoming clearer and more disturbing. Russian timing devices suggested involvement by Wagner Group mercenaries or similar operators. French explosives pointed to either stolen military supplies or direct government complicity. The Ivorian connection through the fake sergeant completed a triangle of conspiracy that stretched across international boundaries. "They're not just trying to kill me," Traoré said quietly. "They're trying to send a message to every African leader who refuses to dance to their tune." That night, as Traoré sat in his secured compound reviewing intelligence reports, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of increasing his security and going into hiding, which is what any rational person would do after surviving an assassination attempt, he chose to go on the offensive. "Captain Cabore," he called to his security chief, "I want our best shadow team prepared for immediate deployment. "We're going hunting." By midnight, Burkina Faso's elite shadow unit, 6 operators trained in urban warfare and clandestine operations, had been deployed to track the mysterious Jules Kobanon. Using thermal imaging drones and ground-penetrating radar, they had traced a heat signature moving through the dense forest outside the airbase. The trail led not toward the borders with Mali or Niger, where a fleeing assassin might seek refuge, but toward the abandoned mining complex near Coup. These were the same tunnels where rebels had hidden during the French colonial period, a labyrinthine network of passages that stretched for miles underground. From the presidential command center, Traoré monitored the pursuit through encrypted communications. The room had been swept 3 times for listening devices, and only his most trusted advisors were present. "Alpha Team, report," he spoke into the secure radio. "Mr. President, we have eyes on target. Subject appears to be following a predetermined route through the tunnel system. He's not running, he's being methodical, like he knows exactly where he's going." At 06:15 hours, the surveillance team reported something that changed the entire nature of the operation. A red flare had been fired from the tunnel entrance, a signal. Within minutes, a black SUV with no license plates emerged from the forest and parked near the tunnel opening. "Do not engage," Traoré ordered firmly. "Document everything. I want to know who's receiving our ghost." The team watched through high-powered optics as Jules Kobanon emerged from the tunnels carrying a metal briefcase. The SUV's driver, a figure in tactical gear, handed him a satellite phone. They spoke briefly, then Kobanon discarded the phone in nearby bushes and climbed into the vehicle. "Sir, vehicle is moving south," reported the team leader. "Shall we pursue?" "Maintain distance. Do not lose them." For the next 4 hours, the shadow unit followed the SUV through back roads and smugglers' trails that most people didn't even know existed. The route took them toward the Ghana border, but instead of crossing, the vehicle turned into an area that appeared on no official maps, a defunct mining operation that had been closed for decades. What they discovered there made Traoré realize the true scope of the conspiracy against him. "Mr. President," the team leader's voice was tense over the radio, "you need to see this. We count at least 12 individuals at the site, all armed, 3 vehicles, military-grade communications equipment, and," he paused, "Sir, one of them is wearing Ivorian military insignia." Through the drone's camera, Traoré could see the figure clearly, an officer in the distinctive uniform of the Côte d'Ivoire Presidential Guard. This was no longer just an assassination attempt, it was an international conspiracy involving at least 2 governments. "Identify the officer if possible," Traoré ordered. The drone operator zoomed in on the man's face, capturing high-resolution images that were immediately run through facial recognition software. Within 20 minutes, they had their answer. "Colonel Modibo Sangare," reported Lieutenant Colonel Sowadogo, Traoré's intelligence chief, "former French Foreign Legion, trained at St. Cyr Military Academy. He was transferred to the Ivorian Presidential Guard 2 years ago with high recommendations. But there's more. Interpol has a sealed file on him related to an unsolved assassination in Mali." Traoré studied the photograph of Sangare on his tablet. The man had the bearing of a professional soldier, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a killer. This was not some rogue operation. It was a carefully planned international conspiracy. "Keep watching," he ordered. "I want to know everything they do, everyone they meet, and everywhere they go." As dawn broke over the mining site, the surveillance team witnessed something that revealed the true audacity of the plot against Traoré. Trucks began arriving at the compound, carrying not weapons or explosives, but sophisticated broadcasting equipment. Cameras, lighting rigs, satellite uplink systems, and editing stations. They're setting up a television studio, military-grade broadcast equipment capable of reaching satellites.
The pieces of the puzzle began falling into Traoré's mind. This wasn't just about killing him, it was about controlling the narrative of his death. They planned to broadcast whatever version of events served their purposes, potentially triggering the political crisis they needed to justify international intervention.
Back at the presidential palace, another development sent shockwaves through the government. The French ambassador to Burkina Faso, Philippe Marron, had requested an urgent meeting. He arrived with unusual haste, accompanied by 2 assistants and an air of barely concealed nervousness. Traoré agreed to meet with the ambassador, but insisted on standard security protocols. All electronic devices were confiscated at the entrance, and the meeting was recorded through hidden cameras that the French delegation couldn't detect. Ambassador Marron was a career diplomat in his late 50s, usually smooth and confident in his dealings with African leaders. Today, however, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his hands trembled slightly as he opened his briefcase. "Mr. President," he began in his practiced diplomatic French, "I must first express France's relief that you survived this morning's tragic accident. The French government condemns all violence against democratically elected leaders." "Accident," Traoré repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the metal fragment bearing the Marseille serial number, placing it carefully on the table between them. "This would suggest otherwise, Ambassador." Marron's eyes fixed on the fragment, and his reaction was immediate and telling. That could be a forgery. Anyone could have etched those numbers after the explosion." The silence in the room stretched taut. Traoré had not mentioned anything about serial numbers or what they might indicate. The ambassador's assumption revealed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed unless he was already aware of the bomb's components. "Interesting," Traoré said calmly. "I didn't mention what those numbers were or what they might indicate. Would you care to explain how you knew to call them a forgery?" Ambassador Marron's composure cracked visibly. He stood abruptly, gathering his papers. "France will be conducting an internal investigation into any possible theft of military supplies. We hope Burkina Faso will not jump to conclusions based on circumstantial evidence." As the delegation prepared to leave, Traoré asked one final question. "How many French agents are currently operating in Ouagadougou, Ambassador?" Marron didn't answer, but one of his assistants, a man Traoré had initially dismissed as a mere clerk, reacted instinctively. His eyes flickered toward the window facing the old French consulate building, and his hand moved unconsciously toward his hip, where a concealed weapon might be holstered. More importantly, Traoré noticed the man's boots. They were military-issue combat boots, scuffed and dusty in a pattern consistent with recent forest terrain. This was no diplomatic assistant. He was a soldier, probably special forces. After the French delegation departed, Traoré immediately ordered surveillance on them all, with particular attention to the suspicious assistant. By evening, they had their answer. The assistant, who carried identification as Pierre Dubois, a cultural attaché, entered a private compound near the former French consulate building. Through telephoto lenses, the surveillance team photographed him meeting with 4 other men, who all carried the bearing of military professionals. Most damning of all, one of the men carried a satellite phone identical to the one that had been given to Jules Cabanin at the mining tunnel. The conspiracy was revealing itself piece by piece, and it reached deeper into the international community than Traoré had initially suspected.
That night, as President Traoré reviewed the mounting evidence of international conspiracy against his government, he made a disturbing realization. The sophistication of the plot, the detailed knowledge of his security procedures, the precise timing of the assassination attempt, the immediate activation of an international disinformation campaign, all suggested something that chilled him to the bone. Someone in his inner circle was feeding information to the conspirators. The thought had been nagging at him since the explosion, but he had pushed it aside, reluctant to believe that one of his trusted advisors could betray him. Now, however, the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. At exactly 2:36 a.m., while Traoré sat in his secure command center analyzing intelligence reports, a hidden surveillance camera in the palace ventilation system detected something extraordinary. A hand reached into an air duct and retrieved a small device, a satellite phone that had been hidden there. The camera's infrared imaging revealed the identity of the person retrieving the phone: General Tenno Zeta, one of Traoré's most trusted military advisors and a man who had been with him since the early days of his rise to power. Traoré watched the footage in stunned silence as Zeta read a message on the phone, deleted it immediately, and then calmly walked toward the Eastern Wing where the Security Council was preparing for an emergency broadcast to reassure the nation after the day's events. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Zeta had been like an older brother to Traoré, a mentor who had guided him through the complexities of military politics and statecraft. They had shared meals, planned military operations, and discussed the future of Burkina Faso during long nights when the weight of leadership felt overwhelming. Now, that same man was working to destroy everything they had built together. "Captain Kebere," Traoré called to his security chief, his voice carefully controlled. "I need you to discreetly monitor General Zeta's communications and movements. Use only personnel whose loyalty is beyond question." "Sir, is there—" "Just do it, Captain, and tell no one else about this order." While covert surveillance was being established around the treacherous general, the Shadow Unit continued tracking the conspirators at the abandoned mining site. Their reports painted an increasingly disturbing picture of a sophisticated operation designed not just to kill Traoré, but to plunge Burkina Faso into controlled chaos. "Mr. President," the team leader reported through encrypted channels, "the broadcast equipment is fully operational now. They're conducting what appears to be rehearsals with someone wearing a Burkinabe military uniform. Can you identify the person?" "Negative, sir. He's wearing a balaclava, but his build and mannerisms are similar to yours. We believe they're preparing to film a staged surrender or confession." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. The conspirators intended to kill or capture Traoré, then broadcast a false message to the world showing him allegedly surrendering power to a military council. International media would spread the fabricated images before anyone could verify their authenticity, creating facts on the ground that would be difficult to challenge. Meanwhile, intelligence officers analyzing the intercepted communications from Colonel Sangaré's team had decoded several important messages. The most disturbing one had arrived just hours after the failed assassination. "Phase 1 incomplete. Target survived and is alert. Initiate Phase 2 within 48 hours. Prepare broadcast materials for immediate deployment. The transition must appear legitimate." The response had come from a number traced to a location in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. "Understood. Our inside source confirms target will address the nation tomorrow evening. Perfect opportunity for Phase 2. All assets are in position." Traoré realized he was facing a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to remove him from power while maintaining plausible deniability for the international actors involved. The use of sophisticated broadcast equipment suggested they planned to control not just the physical coup, but the information war that would follow. At 4 a.m., Dr. Ouattara, the base medical officer who had treated Traoré's injuries, made a discovery that added another layer to the conspiracy. While conducting a routine inventory of medical supplies, she found evidence that someone had recently accessed restricted medications, specifically drugs that could be used to incapacitate someone without killing them. "Mr. President," she reported via secure phone, "someone removed enough ketamine and propofol to render an adult unconscious for several hours. The timing suggests it was taken sometime in the last week." The implications were clear. They hadn't just planned to kill him in the helicopter. They had backup plans involving kidnapping and forced drugging, probably to create footage of him appearing to surrender voluntarily. As dawn approached, General Zeta made his move. Unaware that he was being watched, he used his authority to redirect half of the Presidential Guard from their southern patrol routes to the northern border, claiming he was acting on Traoré's direct orders. When Traoré learned of this unauthorized troop movement, he knew the final phase of the conspiracy was beginning. "Where is General Zeta now?" he asked Captain Kabore. "In the Eastern Wing, sir, preparing for this evening's security briefing. Arrest him immediately." But when the security team reached Zeta's office, they found it empty. The general had vanished, leaving behind only his official phone destroyed in a glass of water and several classified files missing from the secure cabinet. A search of his quarters revealed the extent of his betrayal. Hidden communication equipment, detailed maps of the presidential palace with guard positions marked, and, most damning of all, a set of photographs showing various security procedures and the locations of classified equipment. General Tano Zeta, the man Traoré had trusted his life with, had been systematically gathering intelligence for months, preparing for this moment when he would help deliver the president to his enemies. By evening, the noose was tightening around President Traoré from multiple directions. The Shadow Unit reported increased activity at the mining compound, with additional vehicles arriving under cover of darkness. General Zeta had disappeared completely, presumably to coordinate the final phase of the conspiracy. Most ominously, electronic surveillance had detected unusual activity on communication networks throughout Ouagadougou. "We're seeing coordinated probing of our cyber defenses," reported Major Compaoré, the government's chief information security officer. "Multiple intrusion attempts from servers in France, Côte d'Ivoire, and what appears to be a Wagner Group facility in Mali." Traoré studied the network activity displays in the Presidential Command Center. The pattern was unmistakable. This was a coordinated cyber attack designed to coincide with physical operations. "They're not just coming for me," he realized. "They're planning to control all information flowing in and out of the country during the coup." At precisely 6 p.m., as Traoré was supposed to be delivering a scheduled address to the nation about the morning's accident, the cyber attack began in earnest. Power fluctuated throughout the palace complex, emergency lighting flickered on, and most critically, all external communication systems went offline. "We're being hit from 4 vectors," Major Compaoré reported, as his technicians frantically worked to restore systems. "The attacks are sophisticated, military-grade intrusion software. They're targeting our broadcast capabilities specifically." Through the chaos, one of the emergency backup screens suddenly flickered to life, displaying a video feed that made Traoré's blood run cold. The image showed a man in military uniform standing before a Burkinabe flag, surrounded by soldiers wearing authentic government insignia. The man looked exactly like Traoré, but this was a body double, an imposter who had been surgically altered or was wearing sophisticated prostheses.
"Citizens of Burkina Faso," the fake Traoré began, his voice a perfect mimicry of the president's distinctive cadence. "It is with deep regret that I must announce my resignation from the presidency, effective immediately. Recent security failures and threats to our national stability have convinced me that I am no longer able to effectively serve our nation." The performance was flawless and terrifying. Even people who knew Traoré personally might be convinced by this deception if they saw it without context. "Due to these extraordinary circumstances," the impostor continued, "I am transferring all presidential powers to a transitional military council led by General Tano Zeta, who will ensure stability and guide our nation through this difficult period. I call upon all citizens to cooperate fully with this transition for the good of Burkina Faso." "Shut it down," Traoré commanded, but his technicians were fighting a losing battle against the cyber assault. "Sir, the feed has been preloaded into multiple social media platforms and international news networks," Major Traoré reported grimly. "Even if we regain control of our systems, the message is already spreading." Through the palace windows, Traoré could see crowds beginning to gather in the streets. Some people appeared confused, others were celebrating, and a few were filming everything with their phones. The disinformation campaign was working exactly as designed. But the conspirators had made one crucial error. They had underestimated Ibrahim Traoré's understanding of modern information warfare. "Major, do we still have access to the emergency presidential broadcast system?" Traoré asked. "The hardwired system?" "Yes, sir, but it's never been used. We're not even sure it still functions." "Test it, now." The emergency broadcast system had been installed during the previous administration as a last resort communication method, completely isolated from internet-connected networks and powered by independent generators. If it worked, it could override all local television and radio broadcasts throughout Burkina Faso. While technicians worked to activate the emergency system, Traoré made another critical decision. Instead of retreating to the secure bunker beneath the palace, which is what the conspirators expected him to do, he would go on the offensive. "Captain Traoré, I want the palace evacuated of all non-essential personnel. Replace them with our most trusted actors and doubles. Make it look like we're preparing for a siege." "Sir?" "They're coming tonight, Captain. General Zeta will lead them straight to where he thinks I'll be hiding, but I won't be here." Over the next few hours, the palace was quietly transformed into an elaborate trap. Actors wearing presidential security uniforms took positions throughout the building. Body doubles moved through corridors in view of windows where snipers might be watching. Meanwhile, Traoré and his core team relocated to a secondary command facility disguised as a construction site 4 blocks away. The ruse worked perfectly. At 11:47 p.m., surveillance cameras around the palace detected the approach of multiple vehicles with their lights extinguished. Thermal imaging revealed armed figures moving through the darkness, positioning themselves around the building. From his hidden command post, Traoré watched his betrayer, General Zeta, coordinate the assault through encrypted radio communications that his intelligence team had broken hours earlier. "All units, this is command," Zeta's voice crackled over the radio. "Target is confirmed in the eastern wing, level 3. We go in fast and clean. Remember, we need him alive for the broadcast." The assault began at midnight with military precision. Flashbang grenades shattered windows as armed figures in Burkinabe military uniforms stormed through multiple entrances. They moved like professionals, clearing rooms methodically and herding the actors playing palace staff into predetermined areas. Zeta himself led the team that burst into the presidential office, expecting to find Traoré cowering behind his desk. Instead, they found a mannequin wearing the president's jacket, positioned to be visible from the doorway. "Sir," one of the assault team members called out nervously, "there's no one here."
Zeta's face contorted with rage as he realized they had been outmaneuvered. But before he could issue new orders, every screen in the palace flickered to life with an image that changed everything. President Ibrahim Traoré appeared on the screens, very much alive and clearly not under duress. Behind him was the distinctive architecture of the National Assembly building, proving he was not only free but had access to government facilities. "Citizens of Burkina Faso," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced death and emerged stronger. "Earlier today, enemies of our nation attempted to assassinate your president and deceive you with lies. They failed on both counts." In the palace, Zeta screamed orders at his men, but it was too late. The president's broadcast was being transmitted on every frequency, overriding all other signals. "The man you saw claiming to be your president was an impostor, a puppet of foreign interests who seek to return our nation to the days of colonial submission. But I stand before you now to declare that Burkina Faso will never again bow to external manipulation."
From his command post, Traoré watched as the tide turned decisively in his favor. The conspirators, who had planned for every contingency except his survival and counterattack, found themselves trapped in their own elaborate deception. "Citizens of Burkina Faso," Traoré continued his broadcast, "what you are witnessing tonight is not a domestic crisis, but an international assault on our sovereignty. The evidence is overwhelming. French explosives in this morning's assassination attempt, Ivorian military officers coordinating with the attackers, and sophisticated cyber warfare designed to silence your president and control your information." He held up photographs captured by the Shadow Unit, showing Colonel Sangaré meeting with the imposter, the broadcast equipment at the mining site, and General Zeta coordinating with foreign operatives. These forces believed they could remove your president in darkness and present you with a fait accompli. They underestimated the intelligence and resilience of the Burkinabe people. They underestimated our commitment to true independence. In the palace, Zeta's assault team found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. The building was surrounded by loyal military units, and their escape routes were being systematically cut off. Worse, their communications with outside coordinators had been jammed by government forces. "General," one of his subordinates approached nervously, "we need to abort the mission. The president isn't here and we're surrounded." Zeta's face was a mask of fury and calculation. He had burned all his bridges for this operation, betting everything on a swift victory that would establish him as the leader of a new, more compliant government. Failure meant disgrace, imprisonment, and quite possibly death. "We don't abort," he snarled into his radio. "We adapt. If we can't capture him, we eliminate him. All units, weapons free." But even as he gave the order, Zeta knew the game was lost. Traoré's broadcast was being picked up by international media, and the world was watching a democratic president expose a foreign-backed coup attempt in real time. Meanwhile, at the mining compound, Colonel Sangaré was facing his own crisis. The Shadow Unit had emerged from concealment and surrounded the facility with overwhelming force. The broadcast equipment that was supposed to legitimize the coup had instead become evidence of international conspiracy. "Colonel," his communication officer reported with barely concealed panic, "we're receiving stand-down orders from Abidjan. The Ivorian government is denying any knowledge of our operation." Sangaré cursed in French. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize when he was being abandoned by his political masters. The deniability that made him useful for covert operations now made him expendable when those operations failed. "Sir," another officer approached, "we're receiving stand-down orders from Abidjan. The Ivorian government is denying any knowledge of our operation." "Sir," another officer approached, "the Burkinabe forces are offering us safe passage to the border if we surrender immediately."
Through his binoculars, Sangaré could see the disciplined deployment of government troops around his position. These weren't the poorly equipped soldiers he had expected to face. Traoré had clearly been preparing for this moment, and his forces were ready. Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré was delivering the final portion of his address to the nation, his words carrying the weight of a leader who had looked death in the face and refused to blink. My fellow Burkinabés, tonight you have witnessed an attempt to steal your democracy through deception and violence, but you have also seen that your government, your president, will not be intimidated by foreign powers who believe Africa is still their playground. He paused, letting his words sink in across the nation and the world. General Tano Zeta, the man who betrayed his oath and his people for foreign gold, is at this moment surrounded in the presidential palace with his co-conspirators. Colonel Modibo Sangaré of the Ivorian military and his team of mercenaries are surrounded at their base of operations. The false president they created to deceive you has been captured along with all their broadcast equipment. These men believed they could murder your president, lie to your people, and install a puppet government that would serve foreign interests rather than Burkinabé interests. They were wrong. As the sun rose over Ouagadougou on what would become known as Liberation Day, the full extent of the conspiracy was finally revealed to the world. International journalists, drawn by the dramatic overnight events, witnessed the systematic arrest of the coup plotters and the presentation of evidence that would reshape understanding of foreign interference in African politics. General Zeta was arrested at 6:23 a.m. as he attempted to escape through underground tunnels that had been mapped and monitored by government forces for hours. The man who had once sat at the president's right hand was led away in handcuffs, his uniform stripped of all insignia of rank and honor. Colonel Sangaré and his team surrendered at dawn after negotiating safe passage to the Ghanaian border, where they were immediately arrested by Interpol agents who had been coordinating with Burkinabé authorities throughout the night. The sophisticated broadcast equipment they had assembled became evidence in what would be the largest international court case involving foreign interference in African politics since the end of the Cold War. At 10 a.m., President Traoré held a press conference in the courtyard of the presidential palace, standing without bulletproof glass or excessive security measures. The symbolism was deliberate, a leader who trusted his people and feared no assassin's bullet. The events of the last 24 hours have revealed truths that some would prefer to keep hidden. He began, addressing a crowd of journalists from across Africa and the world. This was not a simple coup attempt or even a sophisticated assassination plot. This was an international conspiracy designed to remove a democratically elected African leader who refused to subordinate his nation's interests to foreign powers.
He presented the evidence methodically. The French explosives, the Ivorian military involvement, the sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities that could only have come from state-level actors, and the professional assassins with documented ties to European intelligence services. The message these powers intended to send was clear. African leaders who pursue independent policies, who prioritize their people's welfare over foreign corporate interests, who refuse to allow their nations to be used as proxies in great power competitions, such leaders will be eliminated. The international reaction was swift and divided. France issued immediate denials of involvement, claiming that stolen military supplies could not be attributed to government policy. Côte d'Ivoire announced an internal investigation into rogue elements within their military, while simultaneously recalling their ambassador from Burkina Faso. But the evidence was too comprehensive and the documentation too thorough for simple denials to suffice.
Within days, leaked communications between French officials and Ivorian conspirators began appearing in international media, revealing a pattern of planning that stretched back months. Most damaging of all was the discovery of financial records showing payments from French defense contractors to accounts controlled by General Zeta and Colonel Sangare. The money trail revealed not just a coup plot, but a systematic program of corruption designed to identify and recruit African military officers who could be used to destabilize governments that refused to comply with foreign demands. In the weeks following the failed coup, President Traoré faced a choice that would define both his presidency and his legacy. He could follow the conventional path of quiet diplomacy, allowing the international community to save face while securing private assurances that such interference would not be repeated. Or he could use the evidence he had gathered to expose the full scope of foreign manipulation in African politics, regardless of the diplomatic consequences. He chose exposure. Speaking before the African Union Assembly in Addis Ababa, Traoré presented a comprehensive dossier of evidence documenting not just the attempt on his own life, but a pattern of similar operations across the continent. Financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony from captured operatives revealed a network of foreign influence that stretched from Senegal to Somalia. Fellow African leaders, he declared to the assembled heads of state, we face a choice between comfortable slavery and difficult freedom. For too long, we have accepted the fiction that our sovereignty is respected even as our policies are dictated from Paris, Washington, and Beijing. The speech sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles worldwide. African leaders who had long suspected foreign manipulation of their domestic politics now had documentary proof of the methods and scope of such interference. France responded by recalling its ambassador and threatening economic sanctions. The European Union expressed concern about Burkina Faso's increasingly confrontational rhetoric. The United States, uncomfortable with revelations about its own interference operations, remained conspicuously silent. But across Africa, the reaction was different. Mass demonstrations in support of Traoré erupted in cities from Dakar to Nairobi. Young Africans, connected through social media and tired of seeing their leaders assassinated or overthrown whenever they challenged foreign interests, rallied behind the president who had survived an international conspiracy and lived to tell the truth about it. The economic retaliation came swiftly. French companies suspended investments, aid programs were canceled, and diplomatic pressure was applied to African leaders who had shown support for Traoré's revelations. But something had shifted in the continental consciousness. Ghana's president publicly endorsed Traoré's claims and announced the formation of an African intelligence sharing network designed to identify and counter foreign interference operations. Nigeria's leadership began investigating their own military for signs of foreign recruitment. Even traditionally pro-Western governments in Kenya and Senegal began asking uncomfortable questions about the true loyalty of some of their security officials. 6 months after the failed assassination, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the United Nations General Assembly in New York, addressing a world that had watched his transformation from a young military leader into a global symbol of resistance to neo-colonialism. Honorable delegates, he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced the ultimate test of leadership and emerged stronger. The evidence we have presented to international courts demonstrates conclusively that the conspiracy against Burkina Faso involved state actors from multiple countries, military contractors, intelligence services, and a network of corrupted African officials who sold their loyalty for foreign currency. He paused, letting his words sink in among the assembled diplomats, many of whom represented governments implicated in the very activities he was describing. But this speech is not about the past, it is about the future we are building. An Africa that stands together against manipulation, that shares intelligence to protect our sovereignty, and that refuses to allow foreign powers to divide us against each other for their own benefit. The response was electric. The African delegations rose as one in sustained applause, while European and American representatives sat in uncomfortable silence. The global balance of power was shifting, and everyone in that hall could feel it. Following his UN address, Traoré announced the formation of the African Sovereignty Alliance, a mutual defense pact focused not on military threats, but on protecting member nations from foreign interference in their domestic politics.
Within a year, 23 African nations had joined the alliance, sharing intelligence on suspected foreign operatives, coordinating responses to economic coercion, and providing mutual support to leaders targeted by assassination or coup attempts. 2 years after surviving the helicopter explosion that was meant to end his life, President Ibrahim Traoré had fundamentally altered the political landscape of Africa. The shy young captain who had once seized power to protect his people from jihadist violence had evolved into a continental leader whose influence extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The trials of General Zeta, Colonel Sangare, and their co-conspirators had concluded with convictions that sent a clear message to potential traitors across the continent. More importantly, the evidence presented during those trials had been used by the International Criminal Court to investigate similar operations in other countries, leading to arrests and convictions that dismantled networks of foreign influence that had operated with impunity for decades. But perhaps the most significant change was in the minds of ordinary Africans. A new generation had grown up watching a president who refused to bow to foreign pressure, who exposed international conspiracies despite the personal risk, and who proved that African leaders could survive and thrive by serving their people rather than foreign masters. On the second anniversary of the assassination attempt, Traoré returned to the airfield where it had all begun. A memorial now stood where the helicopter had crashed, dedicated not to him, but to all African leaders who had died defending their nation's sovereignty. Standing before a crowd of thousands, including many of the soldiers who had witnessed his dramatic survival 2 years earlier, Traoré reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. "When I jumped from that burning helicopter," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "I had no idea that I was jumping into a new chapter of African history. The men who planted that bomb believed they were eliminating a troublesome president. Instead, they created something they never anticipated, proof that Africa's new generation of leaders cannot be intimidated, corrupted, or eliminated by those who would keep us in chains." The crowd's response shook the ground like thunder. These were not just Burkinabe citizens, but representatives from across the continent who had come to celebrate what had become known as Sovereignty Day, a continental holiday marking Africa's determination to control its own destiny. The helicopter they destroyed carried a president who was still learning to navigate the complexities of leadership. But the man who emerged from that wreckage was someone different, someone who understood that the price of true independence is eternal vigilance, not just against military threats, but against those who would compromise our sovereignty with false promises and hidden strings. As he spoke, children in the crowd held up signs with the symbol that had become associated with his movement,
Not the lion's head split by a dagger that his enemies had threatened him with, but a whole lion standing proudly beneath the African sun. Today, 28 African nations stand together in the Sovereignty Alliance. Today, our intelligence services share information that keeps us all safer. Today, young Africans grow up knowing that their leaders serve them, not foreign masters. This is the legacy of that burning helicopter. Not the death of one president, but the birth of a truly independent Africa. 5 years after the failed assassination, President Ibrahim Traoré's influence had spread far beyond the political sphere. Universities across Africa had established programs in sovereignty studies, analyzing the methods used by foreign powers to manipulate African politics, and training a new generation of leaders to recognize and resist such interference. The economic retaliation that had been threatened by Western powers had indeed materialized, but its effects had been mitigated by new trade relations within Africa and with nations like China, Russia, and Brazil that were willing to engage with the continent on more equal terms. More importantly, the attempt to isolate Traoré and his allies had backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening the sovereignty movement, external pressure had strengthened it by validating its central premise that foreign powers would use any means necessary to maintain their control over African resources and policies. The man who had once been dismissed by Western diplomats as a dangerous radical was now recognized as a transformational leader who had fundamentally altered the relationship between Africa and the rest of the world. His survival of the assassination attempt had become a continental legend, inspiring songs, books, and films that celebrated the triumph of African determination over foreign manipulation. But Traoré himself remained focused on the work that lay ahead. In his private moments, he often returned to the memorial at the airfield, reflecting on how close they had all come to losing everything in that moment of fire and twisted metal. The helicopter had been destroyed, but from its ashes had risen something that his enemies had never anticipated, an Africa that refused to be divided, intimidated, or controlled. The boy soldiers who had once cheered him at that airfield were now young men and women studying in universities, training in military academies, and preparing to lead their own nations with the same commitment to sovereignty that had saved their president's life. Standing at the memorial one evening as the sun set over Ouagadougou, Traoré smiled as he watched children playing near the monument. One of them, a girl no more than 8 years old, was telling the others the story of the president who jumped from a burning helicopter and changed Africa forever. "And then," she said with the dramatic flair that only children can muster, "he stood up from the smoke and fire and said no more, and all the bad people who tried to hurt him ran away because they realized that Africa's lions are not afraid anymore." The children cheered, and Traoré felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the African sun. This was why he had survived, not for his own sake, but for theirs. The helicopter explosion that was meant to end his story had instead become the first chapter of a much larger narrative, the story of an Africa that had found its voice and refused to be silenced. As darkness fell over the capital, President Ibrahim Traoré walked back toward the palace, past the cheering crowds and the flashing cameras, secure in the knowledge that the revolution he had inadvertently started when he leaped from that burning aircraft would continue long after he was gone. The lion had indeed learned to roar, and the sound would echo across the continent for generations to come.